everyone, to today's history seminar organized, as you know, by the National History Center, initiative of the American Historical Association and by the Center's History and Public Policy program. We have a special treat for everybody today. Volker Berghahn came down from Colombia, of course, one of the country's leading German historians, but also somebody who's, well, today he's going back to earlier pursuits in economic history. Why don't we go around the table?
Could we ask everyone to just say who you are, how you justify your existence in life? Arnita?
Arnita Jones, Executive Director of the American Historical Association.
Albert, we have saved a place for the legal advisor, legal counsel of the American Historical Association. Sure.
Yeah, I'm a historian. Sheldon Guerin, I'm a historian of Japan at Princeton, and I'm a fellow this year at the Wilson Center.
David Nichols, I'm a historian at the State Department, mainly working on East Asian issues during the 1970s.
I'm Kathy Rasmussen. I'm also a historian at the State Department, and I work on foreign economic policy in the 1970s.
I'm Kent Hughes, run a program here on America and the global economy. I'm a lawyer and an economist, so can clearly not justify my existence.
Tom Adams, European historian, retired from NEH.
Devin Fergus, a recent U.S. historian at Edinburgh University. I'm a fellow here this year at the Wilson Center.
Pilarity Sudhir, I'm an editor at the AHA, and I'm interested in the history of the British Empire.
I'm Joey Long. I'm a professor at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Currently a scholar here, Fulbright, at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Sergei Miroshnikov. I am a Fulbright researcher here. I am a professor from Tomsk State University, and my field is American foreign policy.
I'm Andrew Zimmerman. I'm in the history department at George Washington University.
I'm Tim McDonald. I work here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Erin Chapman. I'm a research assistant here at the Center for History at the University.
I'm Tom Bell. I'm a researcher at the Department of Defense.
Paul Foreman, a curator in the Museum of American History.
Let me say just a word about Volker Berghahn, because he's had quite a remarkable career as a historian. I still always seem to think of him about his 19th century work coming on to the First World War, and then his work in the interwar years. And now he is on to the Chicago School of Economics, among other things. Who knows, perhaps even Ayn Rand. This will add a note of suspense to the talk. He is the Seth Lowe Professor of History at Columbia. In other words, it's the mantle of Fritz Stern that has fallen on Volker Berghahn, and so I guess we can expect all of the knowledge and the wisdom to be reflected in your comments today. But despite all of this fame and glory about being the Seth Lowe Professor at Columbia, what really impresses me about Volker Berghahn is his wife, because she has started up this publishing company on anthropology and modern European history that is one of the real successes in 20th century publishing. So I hope that you'll convey our best wishes to Marion when you get back to your evening conversation about what books should be published in the Berghahn Press. This is Volker Berghahn.
Thank you, Roger, for your kind words and the introduction. And, of course, I will take these best wishes to my wife, because these days a publisher really needs them, I think. Well, the purpose of the seminar, as you know from the flyer that has been sent round, is to promote, quote, critical discussion of ongoing research, or to present, quote, bold arguments and imaginative yet balanced interpretations across a broad spectrum of topics and approaches. And when I received this invitation, I first thought of offering a self-critical discussion of my current research, which is on transatlantic trade relations, actually. So I didn't realize I would be in this building quite close to the Department of Trade and Commerce. But then I was attracted by the second theme of the seminar series, bold argument across a broad spectrum of topics and approaches. However, I'm the first to admit at the outset that you may not find my argument very balanced. Then there are two reasons for this. To begin with, like many people, I'm very frustrated by what we've all been seen happening in the world economy in recent years. But for a long time, I've also been unhappy about the gap, or better still, the abyss between economics and business studies on the one hand and the kind of history that is being done in most history departments around the country on the other. So my hope is that the present crisis actually offers an opportunity to rebuild bridges that once existed. So what am I proposing to do? My lecture is divided into 4 parts. I will start with a set of quotations from the correspondence of a retired CEO of a major American bank that I was fortunate enough to gain access to. Secondly, I will try to provide a survey of the roots of our present crisis and the responses of politicians and senior officials to what John Maynard Keynes once called casino capitalism, of the kind that we've witnessed in recent years. Thirdly, I'm interested in the role of academic economists in this picture and the evolution of this particular discipline during the past 3 decades. And fourthly, I propose to discuss what I would like to call a constitutional approach to the solution of our economic problems and how the discipline of history might contribute to its formulation and specification. So let me begin with my first point, the correspondence of my senior banker. There is one moment on June 21st when he looks back to the boom years and writes, "I have for a good while been critical with regard to the sense of trusteeship which some issuing houses seem to exhibit at the end of the wild period. It was a period of general madness, but it went particularly far in floating securities that were supposed not to be speculative but sound investments," end of quote. 1 month later, he added, "Of course, the whole situation is quite unprecedented, and it does not seem as though anybody's mind has grasped the complexity sufficiently to point a way out." There is a statement of March in which he concedes that, quote, "the things that have been done in Washington should have a constructive value. They have undoubtedly prevented matters from getting worse. But it is not just Washington that is on his mind, but also his former colleagues." And he writes, I quote, "The thing we need above everything to maintain a better market is the return of confidence in the banks. That has got to start with the bankers themselves. They have lost confidence and are running with terribly strong reserves and have pretty nearly ceased doing banking business," end of quote. He adds a little later, "I'm critical not only of the system, but highly critical of some of the men and the methods that they have developed under it. I would agree with you," that is his addressee, "that the present credit situation is intolerable. Some of the great banks have ceased to do any banking business." Moving on to the mortgage crisis, he insists, quote, "There is a great need to work out, I believe, on a national basis, a plan for a more equitable handling of real estate mortgages. The approval of too many loans has, in his view, I quote again, been one of the major causes of the banking debacle. Any use of demand deposit for such capital purposes as real estate mortgages is, to my mind, completely unsound. Not least, as he writes in another letter, because repossession cannot proceed without, I quote, unfortunate social reactions and requires more optimism than I have. However, with respect to solving the banking crisis more generally, he repeatedly advocates a reorganization of banking structures. He wants to deconcentrate big banks and proposes in November that the segregation of the two types of banking, commercial and investment, would be the most constructive type of banking reform, end of quote. More specifically, he would like to see some legislation along the lines of Glass, in other words, the Glass-Steagall Act, that I will come back to in a moment. At the same time, he realizes that while the general, I quote, the general public is very much sold on bank reform, the older business element strikes me as being as fixed in their ideas as Wall Street, end of quote. Later, he admits angrily that the Stan Patters object to the enactment of any social legislation, and they are the same people who, while paying lip service to the views expressed by Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, would oppose any legislation to advance these principles, end of quote. Finally, he is also very critical of academic professionals, confessing in May, quote, "I have come to have a very low opinion of economists, almost as low as I have of banking, but would not make that condemnation sweeping as applied to either class." Now, this quotation leads me to the second and third parts of my presentation, but let me tell you first who this banker is, because it relates directly to my title, Modern Economics and the Nemesis of History. And I'm glad there are so many historians, so I hope I'm not getting too much flack from all of you, although I look forward to our discussion. He is Frank Vanderlip, former president of the National City Bank, who retired in 1919 and until his death in 1936 became one of the elder statesmen of American and international banking. The quotation I gave you are from his correspondence of the years 1932 to 1935. In the first quotation about the wild years, he referred, of course, to the boom period in the 1920s that preceded the 1929 Depression when, as John K. Galbraith put it in his book The Great Crash, speculation was not just something for a few risk takers, but became part of American culture, as he puts it. So if these quotations by an acute and knowledgeable observer of the 1930s are any guide, they strengthen the argument of those who have asserted that history in many fundamental ways has now repeated itself. But I suspect they too would have been as surprised as I was about the striking parallels when I read Vanderlip's letters. True, Alan Greenspan, who until 2006 presided over the wild years of the 1990s, expressed shocked disbelief at what happened during the past 2 years or so. But it should not be forgotten that he had for a long time been a neoclassical economist who believed in the sole and beneficial role of the market and favored deregulations that we first saw during the Reagan years and that were continued in subsequent administrations all the way to the scrapping of the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act. This was the piece of legislation that Vanderlip thought in the 1930s was vital to the restoration of a healthy banking system and whose passage had barred banks that had performed essential functions like accepting deposits and extending loans from making risky bets in the securities market, end of quote. But by the 1990s, if not before, America's neoclassical economists and politicians were pushing for the unencumbered freedom of action of the banking system in the market. This was the time, to quote the George Mason University economic historian Joanna Bockman, when, I quote, mainstream economics in the United States and around the world was founded on the view that markets free from outside intervention are the most efficient way to allocate resources, end of quote. Accordingly, Glass-Steagall came under fire. In 1991, John Duggan, the control of the currency of all people, wrote his influential book whose title, Modernizing the Financial System, Recommendations for Safer, More Competitive Banks, now seems a trifle ironic. Therein he argued that, I quote, laws must be adapted to permit banks to reclaim profit opportunities they have lost in changing markets. Where banking organizations have natural expertise in other lines of business, they should be allowed to provide it. Adapting to market innovation is critical." End of quote. By 1999, this pressure had become so strong as to lead to the abolition of the Glass-Steagall Act that had provided a firewall between commercial banking and investment banking. It was replaced by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, in the crafting of which the American Bankers Association had a major self-interested share. No less important, this change was preceded in 1994 by the Regal-Neal Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act, please note the title, that scrapped barriers to interstate banking. It was incidentally a measure against which Vanderlip had also warned in the 1930s. This deregulatory legislation helped to facilitate an enormous growth of the largest 20 banks that controlled about 35% of the market in 1990 to their dominating some 70% of the market by the end of the decade of the 90s. To be sure, at one point, Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan began to get worried about the stock market boom that was stimulated by these changes and an array of new, and you remember them, instruments and vehicles that were being invented by the giant institutions, warning against the irrational exuberance that he saw on Wall Street and other markets around the world. But nothing, of course, was done about it. However, for reasons of time and space, I have to take a shortcut now and move from the years of boom and great optimism that the secrets of long-term growth well into the first half of the 21st century had been found, straight to the great crisis that we have experienced over the past 3 years. Assuming that you are well familiar with the broad outlines of this crisis, I would merely like to refer you to the numerous books that you can find on display in any major bookstore now, and end with a quotation from a very recent study that puts all of it into a nutshell. There is merely one book that I found really fascinating by a British journalist of the Financial Times, Gillian Tett's Fool's Gold, How the Bold Dream of a Small Tribe at J.P. Morgan was corrupted by Wall Street greed and unleashed a catastrophe. That's the title. Finally, and most recently, there is, in a similar vein, Scott Peterson's The Quants, How a New Breed of Math Whizzes Conquered Wall Street and Nearly Destroyed it. By quants, the author means those speculators in the global financial markets who, to quote Harry Hurd, made their trading decisions on complex quantitative analyses informed by advanced mathematics. No less significant, also for my subsequent analysis of modern macroeconomics, some quants, Peterson continues, made billions for themselves and several prominent Wall Street firms, only to lose most, if not all, their gains in the market collapse that began in the summer of 2007. End of quote. The trauma that the current depression has caused among economic and political elites in this country and the rest of the world, and especially in Europe, and the misery that it has brought for millions of people who have lost their jobs, their homes, their health insurance in the country, has led to calls not just to reimpose stricter regulations on the financial system and then to enforce these rules. It has also resulted in demands to break up those giant banks that are deemed to be at the root of the world's troubles. Thus, in May 2009, the liberal German weekly Die Zeit advocated a radical restructuring of the banking system. In October of last year, you may remember, Mervyn King, the head of the Bank of England, pleaded for a deconcentration of the most important financial institutions in order to prevent a repetition of the meltdown. And finally, at the end of January, the New York Times demanded that Citicorp be broken up. But let me end this part of my presentation with a quotation from a recent study of Europe's economic elites by Friederike Sattler and Christoph Boyer that puts the banking crisis into a larger transatlantic and above all socio-cultural context. I quote, "The question has been raised whether these European managers who are allegedly being pressured into adopting the Anglo-Saxon model of financial capitalism have recklessly thrown overboard an economic and business culture which had been the proprium of continental Europe, a culture which had been characterized by its ability to maintain a social balance and bring the imperatives of business in line with the needs of society," end of quote. They continue, "Were the European managers simply forced to adapt to the technical and economic changes triggered by the Third Industrial Revolution and globalization, or were they perhaps also driven by personal greed? Be this as it may, increasing unemployment, stagnating or even partially decreasing real wages, and the new poverty arising right at the core of European welfare states are increasingly being seen as unjust," end of quote. Thus, the quote continues, "The market is not only about to lose the loyalty of the man and woman in the street, the politicians are also less and less inclined to get into a position in which they see themselves as exploited by business interests merely as deregulators of the economy," end of quote. Now, as of this spring, there may be some doubt about how far American politicians feel similarly inclined as they rail at bailouts and further deficit spending. To invoke Jeff Madrick, in fact, I quote, "In fact, much of Wall Street has already returned to the aggressive practices that were widespread before the crisis, including high levels of compensation and the creation and trading of risky derivative contracts," end of quote. The older arguments can also be found in Guy Sorman's recent study, and this is the title, "Economics Does Not Lie, The Defense of the Free Market in Times of Crisis." This telling title gives me an opportunity to move to the third part of my lecture, i.e. the study of the role of academic economists in the macroeconomic developments that I have discussed so far. There has been much criticism of mainstream economics, usually defined as neoclassical. However, it is not my purpose to criticize the discipline as a whole. Some very good work was done and continues to be done in various fields of microeconomics, for example. My focus is on the heterodoxies as well as the orthodoxies of macroeconomics. Throughout the 3 decades when the discipline abandoned its earlier post-war Keynesianism and underwent, to quote Nobel laureate Paul Samuelson, I quote, "a persistent movement towards the political right," there were always those who disagreed with their colleagues and put forward as minority positions alternative approaches to the study of macroeconomics. So let me mention at least 2 of the most important among them. The demise in the 1970s of Keynesianism and of neo-Marxism after its brief revival in the 1960s saw, apart from the Chicago School, the rise of what came to be called New Institutional Economics, with Douglas North as one of its main representatives. In what is probably the most concise statement in his book Institutions, Institutional Change and Economic Performance, North defined his analytical framework quite broadly, arguing that he was interested in, I quote, "the rules of the game." But these were not, in his mind, so much formal rules, but rather social conventions and codices, i.e. informal constraints that, I quote him, "come from socially transmitted information and are part of the heritage that we call culture," end of quote. Writing in the 1980s, Robert Solow put it like this, quote, "Few things should be more interesting to a civilized economic theorist than the opportunity to observe the interplay between social institutions and economic behavior over time and place," end of quote. There is some overlap here with the second school of behavioral economics that draws on modern psychology and tries to integrate, beyond the socio-cultural, also emotions and cognition in its analysis of producers, investors, as well as consumers. This means that it is critical of the rather simple notions concerning a rational homo economicus. The British economist Diane Coyle, though ultimately defending modern economics against its critics, also distanced herself from, I quote, the simplistic assumptions about human psychology, the excessive belief in the benign properties of the market, the conflation of general self-interest with narrow selfishness, the reliance on an unrealistic application of rational calculation to decision-making. Behavioral perspectives were also developed with respect to finance, which it is argued in which it is argued that investors are irrational in predictable ways. The most important point to be made about the new institutional and behavioral economists, however, is that most of their orthodox macroeconomic colleagues adhere to the conceptions of their discipline that started from the very assumptions that Coyle criticized. 2 years ago, Christopher Hayes gave a more detailed description of 2 receptions facing off across a basement hallway, as he put it, at the 2007 American Economics Association annual meeting in Chicago. This was the time, you will recall, when the orthodoxies of neoclassical macroeconomics had not yet hit the rocks. As Hayes put it, I quote, "If you wanted to get a sense of the status hierarchies of the profession, this was a perfect tableau. On the one side, a reception in honor of the impending rebroadcast of the late Milton Friedman's 1980 television miniseries Free to Choose, a wildly successful bit of laissez-faire propaganda now set to reach a new generation of Blue State audiences. The room was packed and festive, with several Nobel laureates milling about." And then he continued, across the hall, a reception hosted by the Economic Policy Institute, a left-liberal Washington think tank that advocates policies that are in almost every detail the opposite of everything that Milton Friedman stood for. They all were part of, I quote, "a few hundred self-described heterodox economists at the conference, and belonged to the estimated 5 to 10% of academic practitioners of heterodoxy in the United States. This is how dominant neoclassical macroeconomics had become by the 1990s. This is certainly how I have experienced these striking imbalances whenever I found myself on a multidisciplinary academic committee that discussed appointments in economics to departments that were run by orthodox colleagues. Recruitment was in one's own image, which meant that you had to have published in certain journals. References had to affirm the candidates were world class. I found the single-mindedness with which they recruited their own quite striking. It was hubris, on whose heels, according to an ancient wisdom, as you know, follows Nemesis. What, of course, united them all was their firm conviction that the market was the crucial self-cleaning mechanism that regulated modern economies, in which self-interested people made perfectly rational decisions. They all believed that all this could be expressed in mathematical equations, and hence devoted themselves to the building of very elegant mathematical models. The lure of mathematics is perhaps also important in that it created a common international scientific language. Indeed, to quote Paul Krugman, it was, I quote, "the sheer scope and sweep of the efficient markets hypothesis, not to mention that so many people devoted their careers to it, that allowed to brush off most of the challenges to it." Their hubris was quite well embodied by some of the most prominent advocates of deregulation, even during the Clinton years. Or take the treatment of Nouriel Roubini of New York University, who, in a speech at the International Monetary Fund on September 7th, 2006, predicted the current recession. His words were received with skepticism, even disdain, and his audience burst into laughter when his moderator concluded the session with the words, "I think perhaps we will need a stiff drink after that." The trouble is, of course, that the tables have meanwhile been turned on neoclassical macroeconomics. Many of these sophisticated methodologies have meanwhile become highly dubious. Significantly enough, Alan Greenspan, who once embodied the ideology of neoclassicism, to quote the Harvard economist and Nobel Prize winner Benjamin Friedman, I quote, "With his early dedication to the writings of Ayn Rand and his staunch opposition to regulations while chairman of the Federal Reserve, that private profit-driven economic activity is self-regulating and, when necessary, self-correcting," end of quote. But when in 2009 he published his memoirs entitled, perhaps rather apologetically, "The Age of Turbulence, Adventures in a New World," he agreed, I quote, "that sensible policies can be made only with the help of rigorous analytic structures. But too often we have to deal with incomplete and faulty data, unreasoning human fear, and inadequate legal clarity." And then he went on, "As elegant as modern econometrics has become, it is not up to the task of delivering policy prescriptions. The world has become too complex and interlinked. Our policy-making process must evolve in response to that complexity," end of quote. It was a criticism that George Akerlof and Robert Schiller had been making in their book with a title that gives away their heterodox approach, Animal Spirits, How Psychology Drives the Economy and Why It Matters for Global Capitalism. In it, they wrote, I quote, "The theories economists typically put forth about how the economy works are too simplistic," and they added, "That means we should fire the weather forecaster, not least because firing him means giving up the myth that capitalism is purely good." Since then, this kind of criticism that had once been subdued and more selective, focusing on specific neuralgic points and lacunae of neoclassical macroeconomics, has become more widespread and fundamental. To take, for example, Paul Krugman's verdict, who wrote in September of last year that, I quote, "The economics profession went astray because economists as a group mistook beauty clad in impressive-looking mathematics for truth." This was indeed another fallacy to which modern macroeconomics fell victim in its quest to develop the discipline into the queen of the social sciences that offered a supposedly watertight objectivity. This fallacy was perhaps best formulated by the German historian Wolfgang Mommsen, who, with reference to Max Weber, warned as early as 1984 that nothing was, I quote, "more misguided than a form of empirical social science that did not reflect upon the unscientific premises of its own approach and is unconscious or insufficiently aware of the lines between its own hypotheses and methods and their roots in a contemporary social situation," end of quote. Finally, it was also the assertive presentism and complete lack of interest in and hence ignorance of the historical roots of our contemporary social situation that has now resulted in a major crisis of orthodoxy. Partly because there was so much to lose and entire careers and departments have been built on the orthodoxies of the 1980s and 90s, many neoclassical economists have lapsed into a denial mode. Or they are, to quote Frank Vanderlip's big dictum of the 1930s, in a fog. Some see no need for rethinking at all and expect that, given time, the alleged efficiencies of the market will once again make it the hub of a world economy with its incessant drive towards globalization that no country or region can escape. Thus Glenn Hubbard, Dean of the Columbia Business School and former chair of George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, and William Duggan proclaimed in their recent book, The Age Trap, that, I quote, some hard truths about ending poverty in the developing world, and then proposed a market-driven solution to this problem. They urged the private sector to become more, to come in where governments and non-governmental organizations with their aid programs had, in their view, failed. It is significant that such arguments, coming as they do out of neoclassical business studies, are being published these days. They are directed in part against Jeffrey Sachs, the erstwhile neoclassical economist who, after his disastrous sharp shock treatment of the Russian economy in the 1990s, had his Damascus experience, and as director of Columbia University's Earth Institute has pursued the expansion of sustainable development programs in Africa. Sniped at by his two colleagues across the campus, he pointed out that with the exception of the role of agribusiness, quote, there is no novelty in Hubbard's endorsement of private sector-led development, end of quote. For many neoclassical economists, there is hence no need to change their syllabi, and this also seems to be true of America's top business schools. To be sure, there have been appeals to think deeply about our field, I quote here, to think deeply about our field, its place in education, in society, and in the spectrum of human thought, end of quote. Accordingly, there have also been various voices urging business schools, quote, to rethink what and how they teach students, suggesting that the blame for the financial crisis may partly lie in the instruction in flawed accounting procedures or in the failure to teach business students to behave ethically, end of quote. Having given with much aplomb a PowerPoint lecture about the need for charismatic leadership on the part of the CEOs of large corporations, a prominent Harvard Business School professor was asked in the subsequent discussion at which I was present if courses in business ethics were now included in the school's curriculum. He admitted that there was just one. The other courses were devoted to the time-honored and mostly ahistorical case method of the school that has served as a model for business studies in North America and in Europe for many decades. David Ruccio took a similar view when he conceded in June 2007 that, I quote, there are new research agendas, but what gets taught at every institution in the country from undergraduate to graduate is the same utility maximizing story. Small wonder that his colleague Rakesh Kurama criticized the country's business schools to have actively fostered a mindset among students that it was the pursuit of short-term profits what the training was all about. This, he added, had contributed to, I quote, a culture of an uncritical view of the market. As late as the fall of 2008, experts were still divided, just as in economics, I quote, over whether the curriculum of business schools should be changed in response to the financial crisis, end of quote. In these circumstances, Diane Coyle would say no more than that, would say no more than that in her conversations with many academic economists on both sides of the Atlantic had led her to believe that there was now, I quote, a strong appetite for updating the curriculum. This means that the teaching of economic history, mostly located in economics department, is likely to remain marginalized if it is less interested in quantification and mathematical model than in the more intangible qualitative aspects of business culture. However, notwithstanding the quotes from Frank Vanderlip's correspondence at the beginning of this presentation, I do not want to close my remarks merely with George Santayana's famous dictum that, quote, those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it, end of quote. Nor do I feel, despite my German background, Schadenfreude at this crisis of orthodox economics and business studies. However, I do regret that both disciplines have shown so much disdain for history. To be sure, the past, to speak with the Cambridge historian Piers Brendan, is not a compass, at most a map. I quote, "It gives no clear sense of direction, but it does offer depth to an understanding of the world in which we now live." To refer to Peter Novik's book That Noble Dream, as a discipline, history has abandoned long ago the orthodoxies of the early post-war period and the erstwhile quest for objectivity. Final truths can never be reached, but they are at best asymptotic, as our historical knowledge became cumulatively more comprehensive and differentiated. History is not mathematical and elegant. It is in this spirit that I would like to offer a perspective on the present crisis that builds on the thought of a number of early post-war economists who were deeply influenced by history and their own contemporary social situation in the wake of Germany's catastrophic development in the first half of the 20th century. Faced with the task of developing proposals for the resetting and recasting of the German industrial system after 1945, they became the advocates not of institutional economics, but of what I would like to call constitutional economics or Wirtschaftsverfassungspolitik. Against the background of the experience of a largely state-controlled and highly protectionist system of monopolies, cartels and syndicates devoted to military production for war under Nazism, the return to a competitive private enterprise civilian economy was for them a sine qua non. Unfortunately, time merely allows me to mention the writings of just one of the key figures of the so-called Freiburg School of Economics and Economic History, Walter Eucken, who was profoundly suspicious of a strict government regulation of the economy. Rather, he advocated a setting by the state of a constitutional framework within which private enterprise could freely develop and operate, just as political constitutions, like the American ones, define a framework within which the politics of a national society can be conducted. I trust that you will immediately understand what I'm getting at. A political constitution, of which the American one is a prime example, provides the framework that a society gives itself and within which and within the institutions that are created by it, the politics of that society are conducted. This constitution offers freedoms, but also the boundaries within which individuals and groups can move. They are defined by competitive democratic elections, parliamentary legislation, and also by the courts. However, while the rules of political conduct were defined more precisely by the Founding Fathers, the economic framework and rules were initially left quite vague in this country. This framework only required clearer definition once the United States had become a major industrial and financial power by the late 19th century, and once this power became increasingly concentrated. Observing this development, Eucken next concluded that, I quote, "economic power within a competitive constitutional order should exist only to the extent to which it is necessary to maintain this order," end of quote. The problem of economic power, Eucken added, could, I quote, "never be resolved through further concentrations of power," end of quote. If, to use a modern expression, corporations had become too big, or now even too big to fail, it was in the interest of a democratic society grappling with corporate power to deconcentrate these corporations. To this extent, it was imperative to Eucken and others also to create, again through legislation, enforcement institutions that would be legitimated by law to break up those capitalist enterprises that had become too big. However, constitutional economics, as I have now defined it, starts from yet another consideration. If we view modern capitalism as a highly dynamic system, it is always to be expected that private enterprise and the financial sector in particular, would invent instruments and vehicles that we've heard a lot about that would breach the constitutional framework that had evolved by a particular point in time. In American history, it was the Sherman Act of 1890 that created the first tangible economic constitution of what came to be called antitrust. There is no time for me to go into the origins of this act. It's very interesting, except to say that it emerged from the late 19th century boom and was very much the result of popular pressures against the huge concentrations of economic power in this period. Once promulgated, Sherman and a number of subsequent editions defined the constitutional framework within which American business operated until the boom of the mid-1920s burst its dams, resulting in uncontrolled dislocations that this time led to the collapse of the world economy in the 1930s. The legislation promulgated in the wake of the Great Depression was designed to reorder and adapt that older framework that had become ineffective. Roosevelt's Keynesianism saved capitalism from total collapse, but he also reined in those elements of free enterprise that had endangered the stability of this framework by its innovations in the golden 1920s. But the Glass-Steagall Act was one of those laws that embodied Wirtschaftsverfassungspolitik. It was what Eucken and his colleagues called ordoliberalism, a liberalism that was not out of control, but intermittently redefined the framework of modern capitalism. The Securities and Exchange Commission that was set up at this time, 1930s, to make certain that the new constitutional limits set in the 1930s were observed by the financial institutions. This system would have continued to work more or less well had it not been for the deregulators who came along with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. There may have been few successes, but by and large deregulation, it seems to me, was a disaster. Neoclassical ideology further weakened the existing economic constitution in the 1990s and thereby made it easier for big business and the financial sector with its corporations and banks too big to fail to breach the dams with the help of new instruments and vehicles that had meanwhile been invented and that operated completely outside the existing framework. The scrapping of the Glass-Steagall Act is perhaps the most glaring example where this has led us, together with the very lax enforcement that became the special hallmark of the past 9 or 10 years. As Senator Byron Dorgan put it at the end of last year, the passage of the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act that replaced Glass-Steagall was, in retrospect, I quote, a horrible mistake. No less bad was that the SEC and the Office of the Controller of the Currency failed to use their powers of supervision. And at the SEC, it was not just the problem of the Magdoffs, but, as Harry Markopoulos has argued, who warned the SEC for years about Magdoff's fraudulent schemes, it was also that its lawyers, I quote, never understand finance. It was also that the Bush administration encouraged enforcement passivity. In the 1990s, Joe Klein at the Justice Department had still tried quite vigorously to deploy antitrust to control the merger mania of industry. But there was no one who effectively watched over banking and finance. On the contrary, the economic constitutional framework that had been built in the 1930s and also after World War II was systematically undermined by men who are now once again in the current administration. Capitalism was out of control. It is therefore to be hoped that Volker's ideas about a structural change can assert themselves over the procrastinators in the Obama White House and Vanderlip stand-patters in the financial world. However, to call for more regulation is, in my view, using the wrong terminology for what needs to be done. And not only because it puts everyone's back up and conjures up, often demagogically, notions of a slide into socialism when you talk about regulation. Nor is the concept of streamlining the system helpful because it is too vague and above all quite ambivalent. Rather, the task is to review and adapt with reference to the historical example of post-1945 Wirtschaftsverfassungspolitik, what I call the economic constitution of this country, and to effect a recasting of its current structure that have proven too weak to deal with the innovative dynamism of capitalism that has evolved in the wake of the Third Industrial Revolution and the fall of the Soviet bloc. As in the 1930s, we are again faced with a reform of the Constitution to save the system from its excesses. Karl Schiller, the West German Keynesian Minister of Economics and Finance of the 1960s, once put it as follows, I quote, "Market economies cannot survive without the social responsibility of all, and I would add, especially of the political and economics elites of this country. This is why modern macroeconomics and business studies, whose hubris has now resulted in Nemesis, should not merely turn to the social sciences for advice, but also reconnect to history, a discipline that I believe has to offer many insights into our human predicament." Thank you.
Volker, a question just to help us get our bearings. You called our attention to the 1970s as the critical decade, or at least a very critical time, the death of, or the demise of Keynesianism. I remember as a student at Harvard, a graduate student in the early 1960s, in the economics department, people would say that there's one thing worse than a mathematical economist. It's an economist who is not a mathematical economist. So the beginnings of this certainly were well underway by the earlier decade. How is it that all this came together in the 1970s for such a critical period?
Well, I think here, again, you have to look at the political, economic, social situation that had arisen by the early 1970s, because, of course, the post-war economists were all, or most of them, that was the orthodoxy then, Keynesians. And that is how they had come out of the Depression also and out of the Second World War. Now, the first thing I would say is that Keynesian was not someone who was not interested in sort of mathematical economics and quantification, on the contrary. But of course, what I think unleashed this crisis was, on the one hand, and it started, I think, in this country coming out of the Vietnam War, which had badly overburdened its economy. You remember the currency crisis, the breakdown of all the post-war agreements, Bretton Woods, etc., that had been made. Then there was the oil shock. And of course, there was initially an attempt to try to come out of this with Keynesian means, but you're right, it then proved rather difficult to do that because of stagflation, one of the major problems of that period. And that was, of course, the hour then of the Chicago School, if you like, that had been waiting in the wings. One must never forget that you had a reversal of roles, because Milton Friedman had been writing since the 1940s about a very different approach to running a modern industrial economy, and that is, of course, now that began slowly to replace the earlier economic precepts, and was then picked up, of course, also by the politicians in the 1980s in this country, and particularly in Britain.
Could we ask people to re-identify themselves? Yes.
All right. Albert Beveridge. Do I have to use that? I really don't want to use that. Sorry. Albert Beveridge, I'm a lawyer, and now connected with Hopkins, actually, as a graduate student. I really liked so much that you had, but I find it somewhat ironic because when I was a lawyer, one of my tasks was to help deregulate business, and one of the concerns that American banks had was that the large European banks, especially the German banks, weren't under Glass-Steagall. And it created a huge competitive advantage to the European banks. But that leads me to my question of a new constitutional or economic order, because you now have no longer really a national economic order. It's a totally global order, so that you have sovereign funds, you have hedge funds, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So the problem seems to me immense, as you say. It's difficult enough, as you say, to try to find a national order, which we don't have about our banks, because the SEC never was the primary regulator of banks. It was the Fed, at least the big banks. And we can't get that solved even in the United States right now after this crisis. So I'm really asking you, how does this constitutional order, which has to be on an international basis, even get started?
Well, first of all, grateful for your question, and I feared that there would be lawyers and perhaps also economists around the table. And you are, of course, right that the problem is now a global one. But the first thing I would say is that the globalization that everyone talked about in the 1990s in particular was really, if you look at it closely, a continuing Americanization of the world economy, because the recipes, the precepts that were then adopted all over the world were, of course, those that were developed here. You may be right, although I'm not quite certain whether, there is this direct line, that all this was a reaction to the German Universal Bank. Well, obviously there was the knowledge that in the Anglo-Saxon world that the Deutsche Bank, etc., had these advantages. But I would actually still argue that there were larger forces at work than, trying to emulate that particular model. And that is why you are absolutely right. We are now faced with a major problem of how to have this constitutional economics that I was advocating on a global scale. But nevertheless, given the importance of this country, I would actually welcome if a start would be made here, a serious one, to create this new revised constitutional framework that I was talking about. And in this case, I would hope also that the Europeans might want to follow, because, as you know, they are now also in a terrible constitutional dilemma over the Maastricht Treaty and what is happening in Greece and, in certain European economies. And it's also clear that the Maastricht Treaty is too weak in order to deal with the sort of fallout from the much larger crisis that they have now faced. And clearly there are various proposals on the table to try to revise the sort of that particular constitution and thereby also to revise the principle that had led to the euro and yet again to the current crisis, because it was again the banking world that, of course, is now almost waiting, straining for the Greek economy to collapse. And then, of course, this will have major repercussions, of course, on the euro and the whole system over there. The problem is, of course, that, as you know, Maastricht was a response to a major political event, again, namely 1989-90, and, if you like, the solution of the German question, on the back of which I think it was then agreed that there would be a further tighter economic integration of the European community, and that the Germans, of course, call in particular subscribed to happily at the time, because they were worried themselves about what a blockbuster D-Mark and a blockbuster German country would mean for the neighbors who had all memories, of course, of the past. So I agree with you. I'm aware of the enormous problems, but it seems to me at the moment, all economics is in a crisis. Also institutional economics is in a way, behavioral economics, because things have become really out of joint, and I don't think there are many people, but nevertheless I would suggest that just after 1945 it may be possible to sort of create a framework again which finally brings under control these derivatives and credit default swaps and all the things, the innovations that we have seen in recent years that were totally outside the framework that had, I think, existed for quite a number of decades even in the world economy and especially in the American economy.
Thank you. Dieter?
Yes, thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University, and formerly Everett Foundation representative here, as Volker knows. My question is along your lines, too, of arguing and questioning your interesting concept of economic constitutionalism, which is great and helped Germany really to get out of the doldrums. But now to the critical point and going to the EU and Europe, where we have an interesting experiment, I would say, in economic constitutionalism, the euro. And what we have seen is, of course, an old wisdom that was difficult to achieve, which is, how can you have a currency without a government? And here you have a euro, a currency, and you have a weak political decision-making procedure in particular. And what we have seen is, of course, the weakness that a monetary union without a fiscal union runs into problems, because on the current basis, there's no way that the EU members would be entitled, maybe shouldn't even try to help Greece, because it's not a social union, it's a different mechanism. And here you have a very important element that's lacking in the economic constitution of the European Union. Do you belong to the pessimists then, that the euro is not going to be able to work because there is a lack of fiscal policy, common fiscal policy that should come along with it? What is your point on this? But again, I want to emphasize how interesting the concept of an economic constitutionalism is. Worked well for Germany, I would agree with you. In a national context where you have legislative powers, it works. But if you look, under the condition of globalization, even a G20, as we have seen, has enormous difficulties to pass exactly what you're asking for. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I hope I've made it sufficiently clear that I was not just thinking of the German experience, because, that's why I mentioned Sherman, which was perhaps still the beginning and a rather weak framework. That's why I mentioned the 1930s and the framework that was, I think, adapted and adjusted, reset at that particular time. Of course, it was still primarily national, although, of course, it was then the foundation for the American attempt to sort of reorganize the world economy, or at least the western half of it, after 1945, and many of the precepts of German economic constitutionalism were, of course, taken straight from the American Constitution, namely antitrust and so on, in the 1950s and 1960s. But I would like to be, as far as the present crisis of the euro is concerned, an optimist, because I cannot see at the moment how the major governments of the European Union will allow the collapse not just of one or two countries, but also of the euro. I think that would be the kind of crisis that I would even feel might actually lead to the kind of constitutional impetus really now to deal with those aspects of the Maastricht Treaty that for political reasons at the time were left unresolved and were in fact the weak links that are now being used by, again, well, I call it international capital. I'm thinking of John Taylor and Soros and so on, who are actually at the moment, as you know, almost waiting for the whole thing to collapse because they have bet, of course, against, in favor of this collapse. So I would wonder whether indeed here you do not have similar constitutional pressures that I see also in this country. I don't know what Paul Volker really has in mind when I quoted him that, there has to be structural reform. It seems to me that what we are thinking of is not just sort of tinkering a little bit or doing nothing, but rather to think more deeply, especially about the concentration of power that, as I quoted Eucken, can assume system destabilizing dimensions, and that is what of course we have seen. We've just about sort of avoided a total meltdown.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Andrew Zimmerman from George Washington University. Thank you very much for your talk. It was fascinating. And I'm curious, and maybe this is a question along similar lines of the previous ones, about why the hubris, why the Nemesis hasn't led to a reining in of the hubris, why the crisis doesn't seem to have had such a great effect on, at least on economic knowledge makers. And I wonder if part of it isn't a question isn't because the hubris of economic and political elites who made these decisions was not met with their own nemesis, but the nemesis was the nemesis of other people who weren't part of that decision-making process. And I'm wondering if, sort of short of maybe an as yet unidentified movement of sans-culottes, if that nemesis is unlikely ever to have any effect on those who actually committed the hubris in the first place.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Well, first of all, I think you raised a question about professional politics and turfs, etc. And, obviously, changes in academic discourse and culture are often much slower, perhaps, than even the realities. And I think we've seen this in other areas also. Dominant ideas live an afterlife for some time. But that's why I quoted some of these statements about rethinking that I think is also happening even in the most orthodox business schools. And I must admit I should, before coming here, have looked at the curricula of all the major business schools in this country. I merely quoted some sort of secondary observations on this, but I have no doubt that both on the sort of level of a rethinking of what I call the orthodoxies, but then also, I think, on the level of the ethics of all this, because that's why I quoted Carl Schiller at the end, that, there are always also ethical questions, and I'm hoping, at least, that's where my optimism again comes in, that this has been a shock that has also made the academic world think twice before they go back now to the sort of old course, the old syllabi that we've seen both in economics departments and business schools for all too long.
Thank you. Jeff Herf.
I'm Jeffrey Herf from the University of Maryland. Volker, thanks very much for an important talk. My perspective on this is as someone whose doctorate was in sociology and then escaped to the discipline of history. And one of the reasons I fled lay in what you presented today. We fought a failed and losing battle in the 1970s against the positivism in the social sciences and the attempt to grasp all of reality in mathematical formulas. And one of the reasons that we lost so badly was as difficult as mathematical modeling is and as much sophistication as it requires, it also is very easy and America-centric, because you can model the world without knowing any other languages. You don't have to know anything about any other part of the globe. As a matter of fact, you don't have to know very much about American history either. You have to know very little. And so for decades, many of the best and the brightest, I saw this at Harvard, and you probably saw it at Brown and Columbia, were very attracted to it. And they were united. And it was not just a left-right thing. In every department, there were conservative senior scholars and liberal senior scholars who believed in history and context, and of course, they disagreed with each other politically. But the people who were pushing quantification agreed with one another on method, and they could clean our clock, and they did again and again in sociology and economics and political science. So the narrative you've told is that the economic disaster was the result of the fact that these best and the brightest and smart people wound up on Wall Street and they drove the economy into the ditch. So the question is, what is useful in these methodologies? But there's another way of talking about the economic crisis, which I think one of my favorite local Washington Post columnists, Colbert King, articulated. He's a columnist here who used to be a banker. And he said, as a banker, you're supposed to figure out if somebody can repay the loan. Then if they can't, you don't make the loan. So how much of this disaster was the result of these longer-term, several-decade-long trends in the social sciences and economics that displaced institutionalism history? And how much of it was just a complete failure of common sense?
Well, thank you. After these earlier questions, I seem to be getting some support, actually. Thank you. Because, I can only agree with you, and that's what I try to say, of course, that I think the social sciences, and in this case, I would not just single out economics. I think political science went in a very similar direction, and, rational choice, model building, was just as popular in other social sciences. In fact, I would always see a sort of spillover effect that perhaps started in economics that was then also picked up in other social sciences. And, well, as you remember, I regretted this very much because it could be done, with these models, and as I said also, it was an international language where you didn't need to differentiate and look at the different regions. I, was involved for a number of years in something that, well, here I must be critical of Jeffrey Sachs, whom I praised. He introduced a sustainable development PhD program that tried to combine the sciences, natural sciences, especially climate research, very hard science, with economics. And when it came to the question, well, shouldn't you at least be a bit more interdisciplinary and perhaps also have a few anthropologists who would be involved in the teaching of this long-term doctoral program, 5 or 6 years? Well, he didn't sort of take this on board when, of course, historians, but also anthropologists in this case, would always emphasize that it is also important still to have a differentiated regional knowledge. The problem that, I see with economics was that it was simply applying a number of elegant models to the entire world, and of course it seemed to work for a while, but of course now it shows that we are groping with another attempt also to come to grips with the unilateralism that we've had, not just in economics, and that's where I would always feel this country still has the lead, but also the unilateralism that we've seen in politics. Because I don't know whether you would agree with, not only has the sort of dominance of American economists in the world, as you described it, been disastrous, but also the claim that this country was in the best and unique position of sort of reordering not just the world economy, but also world politics. And that has now also failed, because we are confronted with a need to reconstruct not just a different economic order, but also a different political order. And it takes, of course, any country some time to get used to this, that the world is multipolar again and complicated, and no longer just dominated by one power that calls the shots and unilaterally takes certain measures that, it seems to me, have also been disastrous. It's not just the economy, but now I'm in another area which is not really part of my
We're running out of time fast, so let me take, if Roger agrees, a couple of questions at a time. Arnita had a question. I think Kent Hughes also had a question. The gentleman in the back. And then we'll see how far we get, but
sure.
Roger and I are determined to bring this to a close at 5:30. Then there'll be a chance to continue the conversation over a glass of wine. But so, Shel.
Okay, yeah, Sheldon Garin, Princeton University, another historian, and also somebody like you who's tried to reorganize and set up more interdisciplinary approaches with the economics department with no success whatsoever. So I wanted to ask, again, I think the last two questions have been excellent. I want to follow up on them. The crisis in the economics profession is a crisis that we historians clearly see, but it's not clear that the economists see it, and I'm not sure a couple courses on business ethics are revealing. And I'm just trying to think, how is the incentive structure going to be changed in economics? Because I'm trying to think of a university president anywhere in this country who, faced with the decision of appointing whom the economics department says is a top-flight economist, would say, no, I think economics is in crisis. We're not going to do that. Let's appoint more historians. I'm trying to think of the last time I've gotten a call from an economist. Nobody's called me in the crisis and said, tell me about history. And I'm also thinking of President Obama, who clearly would be sympathetic to all this, but I remember in a New York Times Magazine interview about 2 months into his administration, he actually laughed and laughingly brought up, well, I wasn't going to appoint a Joseph Stiglitz or a Paul Krugman. In other words, the economics profession, such as it's constituted, as you've explained, has a real lock on policymaking. And I'm just wondering, as a question, under what circumstances do you think it's really going to change?
Thank you. Anita?
Well, my question is really the other side of this. I love to hear people make a case for why history is important, but let's just say that economists and business schools decided that they did need that richer and deeper understanding of what's been going on. How ready do you think the discipline of history and historians are to answer that quest?
Thank you. Kent, we'll go. Okay, we'll see if we.
I think it's certainly true that both economic history and the history of economic thought have tended to be squeezed out of economic curriculum, much to the, I think, detriment of the profession. Pardon me?
And of history.
Going back to the shift from Keynes to Chicago, that the particular version was not responsive to the crisis of the 1970s, but it was a broader crisis, at least in the United States, in terms of a confidence in government. You had Vietnam, you had stagflation, you had Watergate. So it opened the door to what was already a strand in American thinking, which is skepticism about government. Most of the alternatives to the Chicago school see a more robust role for government in one way or another. There's an innovation group that sees a greater need for investments of certain kinds and so forth. But until we deal, I think, with that confidence in government, it's going to be difficult to move in a different direction. That right now there's clearly a crisis in thinking about the financial macro people really failed us. But there isn't a restored confidence in government. And the question is, how do we go about that?
Good question. And the gentleman in the back, and then
Okay.
briefly, please.
Tom Adams. The discussion of these comparing this cycle of boom and bust with the earlier one, Great Depression one, almost makes one think of the Marxian pessimism that capitalism is subject to ever-growing crises. And politically, if there's no way of bringing the cyclical force under control, that people will get confident again, new speculative booms will develop, and so on. Was Marx right? And so my real question here is for you as a Germanist, does this bring back some of the actual, would there be a benefit of looking back at the debates between Edward Bernstein and the Marxist economist about, whether Marx was wrong because, in fact, the standard of life is being improved by capitalism, and even more important, the state does not have to be the executive committee of the bourgeoisie or bankers or whatever, that in fact there was a possibility for democratic control.
Thank you. We'll take the lady in red as our last speaker, and then, yeah.
Kathy Rasmussen from the Department of State. I just want to actually sort of add my voice to the sort of the people who are saying, well, are we at a point actually where change can come? Because one thing I thought that was really awesome about your talk was how you sort of grounded, economists as well as the economy itself, obviously, in culture, and say that they reflect their particular time and place. And culture changes slowly, usually. I mean, the reason why Keynesianism is able to triumph only because the shock to the system was so huge. I mean, the Great Depression was big enough to bring Keynesianism to the fore. But you talked about how Milton Friedman had to wait. He had to wait for a long time until his day came, and he had to wait for Keynesianism to sort of exhaust itself in its place in time. Given your comments that we seem to have, narrowly averted the big crash, can change come now, or are we actually more realistic when thinking about not only sort of change among economists, but also people in the economy? Are we more realistic to think about change in a generation? Like, is this what we're really looking towards now?
Thank you. I think some of the questions went in the same direction, and I think we can also legitimately you can take a couple of them as comments, not necessarily as questions. So you have 5 minutes to answer 5 questions.
Well, thank you very much. Well, let me start then, with a self-criticism of our discipline, history. And I think, Jeffrey, you were alluding to this. Of course, history also developed, and I always welcomed this development in all sorts of directions in the 1970s, 1980s. And it became a richer discipline as a result, because when I started, the orthodoxy was political history, I suppose, international history, and biography no more. But then all these different genres came along that, I think make history now very interesting, at least I think also to our undergraduates. But of course what was left out in this large shift out of the sort of balance of power was economic history, partly because earlier historians had made the mistake of excluding economic historians already in the 19th century when they were thought to be socialist historians, not historians of industry and society. And they said, well, we don't want you here. And they went into the red bricks in England, for example, where you had now sort of economics and economic history departments and social history department, whereas in Oxbridge you still had constitutional history and political history and imperial history being done. So I think there's also a rethinking that has to take place, not just on the side of the people who are hopefully also reconsidering what they are teaching their students, and therefore there is a generational approach behind my argument, but also in history. And I find this in my department. We don't have a single economic historian. And, well, I don't know whether I should define myself as one, because I've dabbled in too many things. My colleagues would be very surprised if they had listened to this talk, for example, and now all of a sudden there's a panic. Oh God, we don't have an economic historian. Can we find one? And the trouble is, of course, that we are all sort of in an economic crisis. No faculty lines are approved anymore, and it's impossible to make this shift. So we are also prisoners, I think, here of similar tendencies that you also have in the academy at the moment more widely. So while we all agree that history is important, maybe we should raise our voice a bit more, first with my own colleagues in my department, where there are 40 of them who are all doing gender history and memory and, you name it, but it's not economic history they're interested in. And it's only now, I think, that you have a slow shift occurring. But it would be an opportunity, perhaps, also to open a dialogue, at least with those economists whom I defined as heterodox, and who are, of course, around, even if until recently they were only 5 to 10%. But nevertheless, behavioral economics and also institutional economics does open avenues for a dialogue. But, well, there is departmentalism, of course. It's very difficult to sort of organize all this at a time when we are flooded by information and can hardly cope with all the surfing that is going on. And therefore, I think there is a larger crisis in the academic world which makes it very difficult. Never mind all the larger structural pressures and requirements that we all feel, I think, at least I do around the table, that really need to be tackled. But you are right. I don't think this country at the moment is in the mood to have more regulation, because that puts everyone's back up, especially in parts of the country where, government, Washington, should be as far away as possible. So we are in a real dilemma, and I don't know how you feel about it, but I think economic and political elites do have a sort of major role and job to try to formulate these requirements, and that's why I think there should also be a closer relationship between what the Europeans are wrestling with at the moment. Obama, I think has been accused that Europe for him is a non-entity almost, when in fact I think there is a lot of rethinking also happening in that part of the world, perhaps more so than in China or some of the other parts that have experienced this Americanization and enormous growth of their economies, and find it, of course, more difficult now to accept any sort of attempt to frame again the sort of global operations in which they are also involved.
Thank you. This was possibly the most elegant way I've seen somebody respond to 5 big questions in 5 minutes or thereabouts. Thank you, Volker, for your brilliant talk today. I don't know, Roger, if any other concluding remarks, but I think we all are indebted to you for an inspiring afternoon. Let's give Volker a round of applause.